Hi, medical community. I'm JJ the RT. I thrive on making complex medical concepts incredibly easy. If you want more lessons, be sure to subscribe and like. If there's any subjects that you struggle with, do not hesitate to put them in the comments below. And no, that is not a backdrop. That that's my backyard. What's up, clinical family? Hey, I'm JJ the RT. I wanted to do an instructional video, an informative video on acid-base balance. This is something that respiratory therapists typically manage or work through on a daily basis with arterial blood gases. Nurses, you guys look at these laboratory values as well. Docs, we know you guys look at everything, but I just wanted to do a quick rundown on arterial blood gases. So with arterial blood gases and acid base, we really want to truly understand the relationship between pH, CO2, and bicarb. And just like with any relationship, sometimes there's people that contribute to the problem, and then there's sometimes that people contribute to the solution. The same thing happens in the body as well. Now, when you have two people contributing to a problem, that gets a little more complex. We're not going to get into that today, but what I wanted to do is do some simple arterial blood gases and just look at, normal values, the relationship, and hopefully get to how we can interpret those. If not, we'll do a second part on those. So, um, when we look at arterial blood gases and we look at these normal values, right? We want to know the absolute normal and we want to know the acceptable ranges and the normal ranges that facilities tend to use as far as their guidelines. When we start with that, we look at a pH. A pH, we're going to look at that level to be 7.35 to 7.45. After pH, I tend to look at CO2, and that CO2 normal range is 35 to 45. And then lastly, we look at bicarb, and that normal range, depending on which reference you read, is 21 to 27. So when we look at uh, reference ranges or acceptable values, what we're looking at is um, and what we find acceptable. So reference ranges here, I'm gonna write it down. I'm using my iPad as a whiteboard until I can get to a more established place. But until then, you got a beautiful backdrop. That's not a backdrop. That is my backyard. But reference ranges, okay? Um, reference ranges are going to be pH of 7.35 to 7.45. And if you think about using pH and then CO2 right away, your reference ranges are very, very similar, right? 7.35 to 7.45 on your pH, and then 35 to 45 on your CO2. And then when we look at the bicarb, the reference range, depending on which one you're looking at, okay, we're going to use 21 to 27 just because that's, a typical reference range that I've seen. Okay, you can get, 22 to 26, you can get 22 to 28, 20 to 28, but just a good generic round about number 21 to 27 is pretty common across the board. Now, when we look at these things, the next thing we want to truly understand is the relationship, right? How does CO2 affect pH? How does bicarb affect pH? And what happens correspondingly? So when we think about CO2 and with carbon dioxide, what that does when that increases, okay, when CO2 increases, pH decreases. So CO2 up, pH down. And then the other way around, when CO2 drops, your pH will go up. So they work indirectly. So they work opposite of each other. So sometimes some organizations like to teach respiratory opposite. And then on the other side, on the flip side, the metabolic side, the bicarb, they work in the same direction. Bicarb and pH work in the same direction. So they are directly related. So some folks like to remember ROME for Rome, respiratory, opposite, and then metabolic, equal. So that gives you kind of a idea of a direction and a relationship with those two factors. So respiratory opposite, metabolic equal, meaning respiratory works or the CO2 is indirectly related to pH, so they go in opposite directions. And metabolic equal, they are directly related, they go in the same direction. So when we get that idea, when we get that concept, if you have an absolute normal pH, and what I mean by absolute normal is 7.40. That is the exact middle of 7.35 to 7.45. So when you start with 7.40 being absolute normal, and this is pH, and then you have a bicarb. When you have a bicarb that is 24, because that's halfway between 21 and 27. So a bicarb of 24, and then you have a CO2 of 40, then you should get kind of a homeostasis look, an equal look like this, okay? What happens though is not everybody, not anybody, hardly anybody is ever absolutely normal, absolutely perfect. There's always something going on in the body to make you kind of tweak from that, true north or that absolute zero standpoint. So sometimes, or whenever you have a pH that's elevated, so you have a pH that's greater than 7.40, then you'll have a bicarb that's greater than 24. That's greater than 24. Or you will have a CO2 that's less than 40. So if you have a CO2 that's less than 40 and a bicarb that's greater than 24, your numbers will look like this. Your teeter-totter will look like this. The balance beam tilts away from that true normal look. When you go the other way, when your pH is less than 7.40, so we're looking at the acidotic side now, so 7.40 for the pH. And then my line is going to go this way now, and my bicarb is going to be less than 24. And my CO2 is going to go up to be greater than 40. You get the opposite look on the balance beam. So, excuse the crude drawings, but that's what we got. Okay, so CO2 greater than 40, pH goes down. A bicarb less than 24, pH goes down. All right. So another way to look at it is with arrows. I'm not a huge fan of the arrows, but we can do that just so that we can cover all of our bases. So when my CO2 goes down, my pH will go up. When my CO2 goes up, my pH will go down. When my bicarb goes up, my pH goes up. When my bicarb goes down. So this is another way to look at it. Again, excuse the kindergarten drawing, the handwriting, but I think we kind of get the idea there. So if we can understand that relationship of acid base, right, that we have absolute normal, we have an acceptable range or a reference range. The reference range, again, being pH 7.35 to 7.45, CO2 is 35 to 45, and bicarb, again, depending on which literature you read, 21 to 27, and absolute normal being 7.40, 40, and 24, that will get you kind of a good foundation And then understanding the relationships with that. If my pH goes down, it's probably because my CO2 went up or my bicarb went down, one of the two. If my pH goes up, it's probably because my CO2 went down or my bicarb went up. So just depends on what relationship we're working with. Um, but those are the key concepts that you truly want to understand: your normal values and that relationship. So if you have CO2 causing the problem or a respiratory status causing the problem, what happens is your bicarb tries to correct that problem. If you have your bicarb causing the problem, then your CO2 then tries to correct that. So when you think about relationships, you typically have one person causing the issue, and then you have another person or another factor trying to contribute to the benefit of that problem. So the goal is to balance everything out. Everything gets back to an equal or a normal status. So when you get off balance, when you start to cause an issue, when there's a shift in that normal, okay, when there's a shift in the normal, then you have a backup organ or organs or systems to help bring you back to that normal state. So I hope this helps. Again, this is just kind of hitting the normal ranges, absolute normal, and getting a good understanding of the relationships. So look for a couple more parts with this. We're gonna actually interpret blood gases. We're going to talk about the signs and symptoms and also treatments for these signs and symptoms, and looking at what to do once we understand the interpretations of these blood gases. So I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to be doing this a little bit more, so be sure you subscribe, be sure you like, be sure you hit me with comments, what you liked about the video, what you didn't like about the video, what concepts you struggle with. Be sure to hit me with those as well. I want to bring more information to you guys. So as much information I can get from you guys, that would be greatly appreciated. So I look forward to doing this a little bit more. Plus, you get a pretty nice view. See you guys.